What would you do if you heard someone singing in the fog? A voice so haunting, so beautiful, you couldn't tell if it was calling for help or warning you to stay away. Would you follow it? Would you risk everything to find out what or who was behind it? In tonight's story, three friends ventured to Devil's Slide on the California coast for what was supposed to be a fun camping trip. But when the fog rolled in and the singing began, they realized they weren't alone. One of them disappeared that night, and what the others uncovered will leave you questioning everything you know about legends and the unknown. What was the voice they heard? Who, or what, was the figure on the cliff? And most chilling of all, what really happened to their missing friend? If you love chilling stories like this, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a tale that will leave you questioning what's real. Let us know in the comments, would you have followed the singing? Let's dive in. The wind howled as we rounded the last curve of the winding coastal road. My knuckles tightened around the steering wheel as the RV swayed slightly, the cliffs plunging into the roaring ocean far below. Ahead, a thick bank of fog hovered, cloaking the jagged rocks like a shroud. Ethan leaned forward from the passenger seat, his eyes wide with excitement. "Look at that view," he said, pointing to the misty horizon. "It's eerie, right? Perfect for some creepy ghost photos." I gave him a skeptical glance, shaking my head. "We came here for a peaceful getaway, not a ghost hunt." Ethan grinned. "Come on, Lena. You know you love this stuff. Plus, think of the photos for your portfolio. A haunting vibe could be your thing." In the back seat, Maria, Ethan's girlfriend, shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not so sure about this place," she said softly. "It feels off. Don't you think?" I didn't answer immediately. Maria wasn't wrong. The air here was heavy, not just from the fog but from something else I couldn't put my finger on. Still, Ethan had convinced me to come here, promising stunning landscapes for my photography. Devil's Slide had a reputation for its dramatic views, but also for the countless legends surrounding it. Stories of restless spirits, tragic deaths, and most famously, the ghost of a woman named Clara Nash. "Don't tell me the stories are getting to you already," Ethan teased. "We haven't even parked yet." Maria frowned but didn't reply. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the cliffs, her arms crossed tightly. After a few more minutes of tense silence, we found a pullout near the edge of the cliffs. The RV groaned as I parked it on uneven gravel, the wheels skidding slightly before settling into place. As we stepped out, the sharp scent of salt water filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of damp earth. The view was incredible. The cliffs jutted out sharply into the sea, their edges jagged and unforgiving. Far below, waves crashed against the rocks with relentless force. Ethan immediately pulled out his phone, snapping pictures and narrating to no one in particular. "This is gonna be epic," he said, his voice filled with energy. "Maria, get in the shot. Stand near the edge. No, not too close." Maria rolled her eyes but obliged, posing reluctantly while Ethan fiddled with his phone. I busied myself, setting up my camera, already imagining the shots I could capture once the fog rolled in fully. It was beautiful, yes, but also unsettling in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As we unpacked and set up camp near the RV, Ethan launched into his usual antics, telling exaggerated stories to get under Maria's skin. So you know about Clara Nash, right? He began, his tone deliberately ominous. She was a gold rush widow, back in the 1800s. Her husband left her for a younger woman, and poor Clara. Don't, Maria interrupted, her voice sharp. I don't want to hear it. Too late, Ethan continued, undeterred. She walked right off these cliffs. Some say she was pushed, others say she jumped. But ever since then, people hear her singing in the fog. If you hear it, they say she's calling for you, to join her. I shot Ethan a warning look. Cut it out. You're not helping. He laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. Fine, fine. Just trying to set the mood. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, though Maria stayed unusually quiet, as the sun dipped below the horizon. The fog thickened, curling around the cliffs like ghostly fingers. We built a small fire near the RV, its flickering flames providing some much-needed warmth against the chilling breeze. Despite Ethan's best efforts to lighten the mood, an unspoken tension hung over us. Then we heard it, the faintest trace of a melody, drifting on the wind. The sound was so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. A soft, lilting melody floated through the thickening fog, barely audible over the crashing waves below. I froze, straining my ears. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Maria's eyes widened as she nodded. Yeah. It sounded like singing? Ethan scoffed, leaning back against the RV with a smile. Oh, come on. You're really going to let an old ghost story get to you? It's probably just the wind. But it didn't sound like the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, almost like a lullaby. My stomach tightened as the melody swelled, fading in and out as if carried by invisible hands through the mist. For a brief moment, I felt the urge to stand up and follow it, to find the source. Shaking my head, I forced myself to look away. Maria wrapped her arms around herself, scooting closer to the fire. I don't like this, she murmured. It's creepy. Ethan rolled his eyes. Relax, Maria. It's just your imagination playing tricks on you. Or maybe some weirdo hiker having fun with the whole Clara Nash thing. You go check it out? I challenged, half joking but also curious if his bravado would hold up. He hesitated, and for the first time, I noticed a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Sure, he said after a beat, standing up and brushing off his jeans. If it'll prove there's nothing out there, fine. Ethan, don't, Maria said sharply. Her voice cracked, betraying her fear. He waved her off, grabbing the flashlight from the side of his pack. It's fine. I'll be back in 5 minutes. We watched in tense silence as he walked a few yards away from the fire, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the fog. He moved toward the cliff's edge, pausing every so often to glance back at us. The singing seemed to fade as he walked farther, until it was almost completely drowned out by the sound of the waves. And then, just as suddenly as it had disappeared, it came back. Louder this time, clearer. The voice was unmistakably feminine, sweet yet mournful, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ethan, Maria called out, panic creeping into her voice. Come back. I'm serious. He stopped and turned toward us, holding up his flashlight. See? Nothing? Before he could finish, the light flickered and went out. He swore under his breath, smacking it against his palm. The singing grew louder, more insistent, almost angry. I stood up, my heart racing. Something wasn't right. "Ethan, get back here now," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He didn't argue. Turning on his heel, he jogged back toward us, his face pale in the dim glow of the firelight. "Okay," he said, trying to sound casual but failing. "That was weird. Flashlight just died for no reason." "And the singing?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know. Probably just some acoustic trick. Sound carries weird in places like this." Maria didn't look convinced, and frankly, neither was I. The singing had stopped the moment Ethan returned, but its absence felt as oppressive as its presence. The silence wasn't comforting, it was heavy, suffocating, as if the cliffs themselves were holding their breath. We decided to call it a night, but none of us wanted to admit how uneasy we felt. Ethan stayed by the fire until it burned down to embers, his bravado noticeably absent. Maria climbed into the RV without a word, her usual chatter replaced by a tense, haunted look. I stayed outside a little longer, staring into the fog and listening, half expecting the singing to start again. When it didn't, I finally went inside, locking the RV door behind me. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and even though I couldn't hear the singing anymore, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Lying in my bunk, I stared at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come. It didn't. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. Faint but unmistakable, the melody floated through the night, chilling me to the bone. Why did the singing stop when Ethan returned? What was hiding out there in the fog? And most importantly, who or what was calling to us? We thought it was just a legend, a harmless story about Clara Nash. But by morning, everything we thought we knew would be shattered. What would you do if you were in our shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. And hit that notification bell, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The fog was thicker than I'd ever seen it, curling around the RV like a living thing. It seemed to swallow the world beyond the small circle of our campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the mist. Every sound felt amplified, the crackling of the fire, the distant crash of waves below the cliffs, even the occasional creak of the RV's metal frame as it cooled in the night air. But there was something else too, something just on the edge of hearing. A faint whisper, like someone murmuring secrets into the void. I tried to ignore it. It was just the fog, I told myself, distorting the usual sounds of the night. But my eyes kept darting toward the darkness beyond the firelight, half expecting to see something, or someone, emerge. Maria sat with her knees pulled to her chest, staring into the flames. She hadn't said much since the singing stopped. Ethan, on the other hand, was busy trying to convince us that everything was fine. "It's just atmospheric," he said, gesturing vaguely at the fog. "Sound travels weird in places like this. The cliffs, the water, it's all bouncing echoes around." Maria didn't look up. "That didn't sound like echoes," she said quietly. "It sounded like a voice." Ethan sighed, leaning back against the RV with a cocky smirk. "And I bet if we were in the mountains you'd think Bigfoot was out there." I shot him a warning glance. "Ethan, enough." He shrugged, but his smirk faltered when the whispering grew louder. It wasn't words exactly, more like the cadence of speech, carried on a breeze that didn't exist. It circled us, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Do you hear that? I asked, breaking the tense silence. Tell me I'm not crazy. Ethan nodded reluctantly. Yeah, I hear it. Maria's grip on her knees tightened. It's her, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's Clara. Don't start, Ethan muttered, standing up abruptly. He grabbed a stick and poked at the fire, sending a spray of sparks into the air. It's not a ghost. It's... The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. Even the waves seemed to hold their breath. We all froze, listening, our breaths shallow and uneven. And then the singing started again. It was louder this time and closer. The melody was haunting, a slow, mournful tune that seemed to weave through the fog like a thread, pulling at something deep inside me. I felt an almost magnetic urge to stand up and walk toward it. My heart pounded as I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay rooted in place. Ethan didn't move either, but I saw the conflict in his eyes. Maria, on the other hand, whispered, "We need to go. Now." "Go where?" Ethan snapped, his bravado slipping into frustration. "We're in the middle of nowhere." Before anyone could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the fog, like a branch snapping underfoot. All three of us turned toward the sound, but the fog was too dense to see anything beyond the firelight. We weren't alone. The snapping branch sent a jolt through all of us. Ethan spun toward the sound, gripping the stick he'd been using to stoke the fire like it was a weapon. Maria let out a soft gasp, clutching my arm so tightly her nails dug into my skin. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "What was that?" Maria whispered, her voice trembling. "Probably an animal," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes darted toward the fog, scanning the shadows. "A deer, maybe, or a raccoon." "Raccoons don't sound like they're sneaking up on you," Maria snapped, her fear giving way to anger. "That was something, someone walking." I wanted to agree with her. The sound was deliberate, like a heavy footstep breaking through the brittle remains of a branch. But Ethan was the type to dismiss anything he couldn't explain, and I didn't want to escalate things. Instead, I focused on the fog, straining my eyes against the gray void. Nothing moved. At least, nothing I could see. The singing continued, faint but insistent, threading its way through the silence. It was different now, less mournful and more commanding. Almost like a siren's call, beckoning us closer. I felt my body tense, the primal urge to flee fighting with an irrational desire to follow that voice. "Okay," Ethan said after a moment, trying to sound confident. "Let's not freak out. Whatever's out there, it's not getting past us. We've got a fire, we've got the RV, and I've got this." He waved the stick for emphasis, though the gesture was more comical than reassuring. Maria shook her head. "You're not listening, Ethan. What if it's not human?" I glanced at her, startled. Maria was the most rational of us, always the skeptic, always dismissing Ethan's ghost stories as ridiculous. For her to suggest something so far-fetched made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, the fire flickered violently, almost going out. The air seemed to shift, colder and heavier, pressing down on us like a weight. The whispering was back, growing louder, overlapping itself until it was a cacophony of hushed voices. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. Then the light from the RV flickered and went out completely. Great, Ethan muttered. Now we're blind. Get back to the RV, I said, my voice shaking. We need to get inside. Now. Maria was already on her feet, but Ethan hesitated. Wait, what if... Another snap, this one closer, cut him off. It was followed by the faint crunch of gravel, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, walking toward us. My stomach churned as I grabbed Maria's hand, dragging her toward the RV. Ethan, come on! I shouted, my voice trembling. He didn't argue this time. We scrambled into the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it behind us. For a moment, the only sound was our ragged breathing and the wind outside. But then, just as we started to catch our breath, something heavy thudded against the side of the RV. The thud against the side of the RV was loud enough to make Maria scream. Ethan jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight he'd grabbed as we scrambled inside. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the window, half expecting to see a face pressed against the fogged glass. But there was nothing, just the swirling gray mist outside, thick and impenetrable. What was that? Maria's voice was high-pitched, barely holding back a sob. Ethan shook his head, flicking the flashlight on and off, but it sputtered weakly, casting only a faint glow. I don't know, he said, his bravado gone. Probably just, I don't know, maybe an animal ran into it. An animal? Maria hissed, her fear sharpening into anger. You heard that. It wasn't a raccoon, Ethan. Someone is out there. Enough, I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. Both of them turned to look at me, their fear mirrored in my own expression. Fighting isn't going to help. We need to figure out what's going on. As if in response, another thud echoed through the RV, this time on the roof. It was lighter, like something dragging across the metal. My stomach churned as I realized how exposed we were. The RV suddenly felt flimsy, like a tin can that could be crushed at any moment. Maria whimpered, pulling her knees to her chest on the small bench seat. It's her, she whispered. It's Clara. She doesn't want us here. Ethan scoffed, though his voice wavered. Don't be ridiculous. There's no such thing as ghosts. Then what's out there? I shot back. What's making those noises, Ethan? He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the window, peering out into the fog. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. What are you doing? Just looking, he said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. If it's an animal, we need to know. If it's someone messing with us, I'm not letting them think we're scared. Too late, Maria muttered, her voice trembling. Another sound joined the dragging above us, a faint tapping, like fingernails running across the metal. It sent a shiver down my spine, my skin crawling with the primal instinct to run. But where could we go? Outside was worse. Turn off the lights, I said, my voice hushed. All of them. What? Why? Ethan asked. Just do it, I snapped, my tone, leaving no room for argument. Ethan fumbled with the RV's interior light switch, plunging us into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the dying fire outside, its embers barely visible through the windows. We sat in silence, listening. The tapping continued, irregular and deliberate, as though whatever was out there knew we were inside. Maria covered her ears, rocking slightly. This isn't happening, she whispered over and over. This can't be happening. Ethan gritted his teeth, gripping the useless flashlight like a weapon. I felt my pulse pounding in my temples, my mind racing for a plan. And then suddenly the noises stopped. The silence was deafening. It pressed against us, heavier than the fog, thick with anticipation. I wanted to believe it was over, but something in my gut told me otherwise. The singing hadn't started again, and that somehow felt worse. It was like the calm before a storm. "I'm going to look outside," Ethan whispered, breaking the silence. "No," I said sharply. "Stay here. We don't know what's out there." "Exactly," he replied. "We don't know. And I'm not going to sit here like a sitting duck." Before I could stop him, he moved to the door. I grabbed his arm, panic surging through me. "Are you crazy? Do you want to end up like..." "Like what?" I didn't even know how to finish that sentence. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his jaw clenched, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but we can't just sit here all night." He was right, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. I forced myself to think rationally. "Okay, let's stay together. If you're going to look, we all go. But we don't open the door unless we have to." Maria shook her head vehemently. "No way! I'm not going out there." I placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her down. "You don't have to. Just stay here and keep the door locked. If anything happens, don't open it, no matter what you hear." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Be careful." Ethan and I grabbed the flashlight and slowly moved toward the door. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain covering the small window. I pulled it back just enough to peek outside. The fog was so dense it was like staring into a blank screen. I couldn't see anything. Beyond the faint outline of the fire pit, now nothing but smoldering embers. I started to relax slightly, wondering if maybe we just let our imaginations get the best of us. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the firelight, barely visible through the haze. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My breath caught, and I instinctively yanked the curtain shut. "There's someone out there," I whispered, my voice trembling. Ethan's face went pale. "What did you see?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "A person, I think." The silence stretched out between us, heavy and oppressive. And then from outside the singing started again. The morning came with an eerie stillness, as if the world itself had paused to hold its breath. The fog hadn't lifted. It was thicker, heavier, pressing against the RV like it was trying to seep inside. My head throbbed from lack of sleep, every sound from the night before replaying in my mind like a broken record. The whispering, the tapping, the singing, it all felt surreal, but the claw marks etched into the side of the RV told me it wasn't just a nightmare. Maria was the first thing on my mind when I sat up. She hadn't moved from her spot on the bench all night, curled up with her knees to her chest. Or at least, that's what I thought. When I glanced toward her bunk, my heart stopped. It was empty. "Maria!" My voice broke the silence, sharp and panicked. Ethan bolted upright from the floor where he'd finally passed out. "What's wrong?" "She's gone," I said, already moving toward the door, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. The cold air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside, scanning the immediate area. The fog was as dense as ever, reducing visibility to just a few feet in every direction. "Maria!" I shouted, the sound of her name swallowed by the mist. Ethan was right behind me, his eyes darting around. "She couldn't have gone far," he muttered, more to himself than me. The door was locked all night. I wanted to believe that, but dread was coiling in my stomach like a living thing. The fog felt alive, shifting and curling with every breath of wind. It was impossible to tell where anything was, or anyone. "Maria!" I called again, my voice cracking. I spun around, searching for any sign of her, footprints, dropped belongings, anything. "Over here!" Ethan's voice came from the other side of the RV. I ran toward him, nearly slipping on the damp ground. He was crouched near the edge of the clearing, pointing to the ground. Footprints, small and distinct, leading away from the RV and straight into the fog. My stomach sank as I followed the trail with my eyes. The prints were erratic, crisscrossing at odd angles, like she'd been pacing or running. She didn't take her stuff, Ethan said, glancing toward the RV. Her phone, her jacket, it's all still inside. Why would she leave without telling us? I asked, my voice trembling. She wouldn't just walk off. Ethan didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. I could see the gears turning in his head, but neither of us wanted to say what we were both thinking. Maria hadn't left by choice. We followed the footprints cautiously, the fog swallowing the trail after just a few yards. Every step felt like a gamble, the dense mist playing tricks on my eyes. Shapes seemed to shift and move at the edges of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Maria! Ethan shouted, his voice echoing faintly before being absorbed by the fog. And then, faint and distant, we heard it. Her voice. Help! It was weak, barely audible, but unmistakably Maria's. It came from somewhere ahead, deeper in the fog. I felt a surge of hope and fear. What was she doing out there? Why hadn't she come back? Maria, we're coming! I yelled, breaking into a run. Ethan grabbed my arm, pulling me back. Wait, he said, his voice low and tense. It doesn't sound right. What do you mean? I snapped, trying to pull away. Just listen, he said, his grip tightening. Does it sound like she's moving? I stopped and listened. He was right. The voice didn't shift or grow louder. It was static, coming from the same direction, the same distance. My hope wavered, replaced by a sick feeling in my gut. Maria! Ethan shouted again, his voice louder this time. The response was the same, a faint, distant, help. But now that I was paying attention, it didn't sound like a plea. It sounded wrong. The cadence, the tone, it was hollow, as though it were being repeated, not spoken. My heart sank as realization crept in. What if that's not her? I whispered. Ethan's face paled, but before he could respond, the fog shifted again, and the singing started. The singing cut through the fog like a knife, low and mournful, carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. It wasn't Maria's voice, it was something else entirely. Ethan and I froze, the sound winding its way through the mist, closer than it had been the night before. Do you hear that? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the swirling gray around us. It's her, he muttered. Not Maria, the other one. The realization hit us at the same time. This was the singing we had heard before, the one tied to Clara Nash, the woman from the legends. My stomach churned as I tried to make sense of it. Maria was out here, somewhere, but this wasn't her voice calling for help. And whatever it was, it wanted us to follow. We need to go back to the RV, Ethan said, his voice unsteady. Now. What about Maria? I snapped, my heart pounding. We can't just leave her. He grabbed my arm, his grip firm. Lena, listen to me. If we go any deeper into this fog, we might not come back either. We need to think this through. As much as I hated to admit it, he was right. The fog felt suffocating, almost sentient, as if it were deliberately pulling us in. But the thought of leaving Maria out here alone, lost and terrified, was unbearable. Another faint cry for help echoed through the mist. "Help me!" The words hung in the air, distant and distorted. This time, I couldn't stop myself. I broke away from Ethan and ran toward the sound, ignoring his shout behind me. The fog swallowed me almost immediately, the air damp and cold against my skin. My footsteps felt muffled, the ground uneven beneath me. "Maria!" I called, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" The singing grew louder, more melodic, and I felt a strange pull, as though invisible hands were guiding me. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but something deeper kept me moving forward. I stumbled on a root, nearly falling, and caught myself against a tree. That's when I saw it. Maria's flashlight lying on the ground, cracked and dark. I crouched down, my hand shaking as I picked it up. Nearby, the earth was disturbed, claw marks gouged deep into the soil. My stomach churned at the sight. "Lena!" Ethan's voice cut through the fog, closer now. He emerged moments later, his face pale, and his chest heaving from running. "What are you doing? You can't just run off like that." I held up the flashlight, my hand trembling. "It's Maria's. She was here." Ethan's eyes darted to the claw marks, his expression hardening. "What the hell?" Before I could answer, the singing shifted, the melody turning sharper, almost angry. The fog around us grew thicker, curling unnaturally. I could barely see Ethan standing just a few feet away. Then, from somewhere close, too close, we heard the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. "Maria?" I called, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. Silence hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Ethan moved closer to me, his knuckles white as he gripped a stick he'd picked up earlier. "That's not her," he whispered. The singing began again, softer now, as if it were moving farther away. The footsteps resumed, but this time they circled us. My breath caught as I turned, trying to follow the sound, but I couldn't see anything through the mist. "We need to get out of here," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Now. What about Maria?" I protested, tears stinging my eyes. "We can't just leave her." Ethan didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened as he glanced around, the fear in his eyes mirroring my own. "We'll come back with help," he finally said. "But if we stay here, we're dead." I wanted to argue, but the sound of the footsteps growing closer silenced me. Whatever was out here wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. I nodded reluctantly, and we turned back toward the RV. The walk back was a blur of fear and desperation. The fog seemed thicker, heavier, and the singing followed us like a shadow, never too far behind. By the time we reached the RV, my legs felt like jelly, and my chest ached from holding my breath. We scrambled inside, locking the door behind us. But just as I thought we were safe, I glanced at the window and froze. There, etched into the fog glass, was a single word, written in jagged, dripping letters. "Stay!" The word on the window sent a shiver down my spine. Stay. It was jagged, uneven, as if scratched by claws instead of fingers. The letters dripped with condensation, making them look fresh, as if they'd just been written. Ethan and I stared at it in silence, the weight of the words settling over us like a suffocating blanket. "What the hell?" Ethan whispered, stepping closer to the window. He raised a hand to touch it, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. "Whatever wrote that, it's still out there." Ethan nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "This isn't normal," he muttered, pacing the small space of the RV. "None of this is normal." I sat down heavily on the bench, my head in my hands. Maria was still out there, somewhere in the fog, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to go back out and find her. But the rational part of me knew we couldn't. Not yet. "We need to call for help," I said finally, looking up at Ethan. "The police, search and rescue, someone who knows what they're doing." Ethan pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he unlocked it. "No signal," he said after a moment, holding it up as if that would make a difference. "Figures. I checked mine too, but the result was the same. No bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. It was like the fog had swallowed more than just the landscape. It had cut us off completely." "We can drive out," Ethan suggested, though his voice lacked confidence. "The RV's got plenty of gas. We can get to a ranger station or something." I nodded, clinging to the plan like a lifeline. "Okay, let's go." We didn't waste any time. Ethan started the engine while I secured the inside of the RV, making sure nothing would shift or fall as we drove. The hum of the engine was a small comfort, breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over us. But as Ethan shifted into gear and the RV began to move, the fog outside seemed to close in even tighter. The headlights barely cut through the mist, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Ethan leaned forward in his seat, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "I can't see anything," he muttered, his voice tense. "Just go slow," I said, my eyes scanning the fog for any sign of movement. Every shadow looked like a figure, every flicker of light a pair of eyes watching us. We hadn't gone more than 100 yards when the RV shuddered violently, jerking to a stop. Ethan cursed, slamming on the brakes. "What the hell was that?" I peered out the front window, but the fog was too thick to see anything. "Did we hit something?" "Stay here," Ethan said, reaching for the flashlight. "I'll check it out." "No way," I said, grabbing his arm. "You're not going out there alone." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but stay close." We stepped out of the RV together, the cold air biting at my skin. The fog was so dense it felt like walking through a cloud, the moisture clinging to my hair and clothes. The headlights illuminated the ground in front of us, revealing a pile of rocks scattered across the road. "That's what we hit," Ethan said, crouching down to inspect them. "But where did they come from?" I glanced around, my heart pounding. The rocks were jagged and dark, as if they'd been freshly unearthed. But there was no sign of a landslide, no disturbance in the ground around us. It was as if they'd been placed there intentionally. "Ethan," I said, my voice trembling, "we need to go." Before he could respond, the singing started again, louder this time. It was coming from somewhere behind us, deep in the fog. The melody was slow and haunting, pulling at something deep inside me. I felt my body tense, the same magnetic urge from before urging me to follow it. Ethan grabbed my arm, snapping me out of the trance. "Don't," he said, his voice sharp. "Get back in the RV. Now." We scrambled back inside, slamming the door shut. The singing didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right outside. The RV rocked slightly, as if something or someone was pushing against it. "What do we do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at the windshield, his face pale. I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. A figure was standing in the fog, just beyond the reach of the headlights. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. But the singing, it was coming from her. She stood completely still, her head tilted slightly as if she were watching us. and then, without warning, she took a step closer. The figure moved with an unnatural slowness, her steps deliberate and rhythmic, as if she were part of the melody that echoed through the fog. Ethan and I sat frozen in the RV, too terrified to move. The headlights barely illuminated her outline, but I could make out the flowing white of her dress, the fabric fluttering slightly as though caught in a breeze we couldn't feel. "Is she real?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Ethan shook his head, his eyes locked on the figure. I don't know," the singing continued, soft and melodic, but the closer she came, the more it twisted into something darker. The notes seemed to vibrate in my chest, pulling at something primal inside me, a deep yearning I didn't understand. My hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. "We need to leave," Ethan whispered, barely audible over the sound of her voice. "Now." He reached for the ignition, his hand trembling, and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. He cursed under his breath, trying again. The RV groaned, the engine coughing like it was fighting the fog itself. Come on, Ethan muttered, his voice rising with panic. I glanced back at the figure. She was closer now, her head tilted slightly as if studying us. I could see her hair, long and dark, falling over her face, obscuring her features. But it wasn't her appearance that terrified me. It was the way she moved. Her steps were too smooth, too precise, like she wasn't walking at all but gliding across the ground. The singing grew louder, more urgent. I felt a strange pull in my chest, an almost overwhelming desire to open the door and step outside. My hand moved toward the handle without thinking, and it wasn't until Ethan grabbed my wrist that I snapped out of it. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his grip tight. I stammered, my mind reeling. "I don't know. I couldn't stop." "She's messing with you," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Don't listen to her." The RV rocked suddenly, as if something heavy had slammed into it. I let out a startled scream, and Ethan jumped, his eyes darting toward the back. Another thud came, this time from the roof, followed by the sound of something dragging across the metal. The figure, outside, stopped moving, her head snapping upward as if listening. "What is she doing?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ethan didn't answer. He was too busy trying the ignition again, his knuckles white against the key. The RV sputtered once more before roaring to life, the sound cutting through the singing like a knife. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. The figure stepped closer, now fully illuminated by the headlights. I could see her dress was torn and dirty, stained with something dark that spread like ink across the fabric. Her hair still obscured her face, but I could feel her gaze, heavy and piercing, like a physical weight pressing down on me. "Drive," I said, my voice shaking. "Ethan, go!" He slammed the RV into gear, and it lurched forward, the tires skidding on the damp ground. The figure didn't move, but as we passed her, the singing stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, heavier than the fog that surrounded us. "She's gone," Ethan said, his voice tight with fear. "We're leaving her behind." But even as he said it, I knew it wasn't true. The silence wasn't relief, it was anticipation, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The fog didn't let up, and the narrow road twisted and turned, each bend feeling like a trap. The headlights barely cut through the mist, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the edges of the cliffs. "Do you think she's still back there?" I asked, breaking the silence. Ethan didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly I thought he might break it. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I'm not stopping to find out." I nodded, though my stomach was still knotted with fear. I turned to look out the window, hoping to see the fog thinning, but instead I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was there, standing in the road ahead. "Stop!" I screamed, grabbing Ethan's arm. He slammed on the brakes, and the RV screeched to a halt. The figure didn't move. She stood in the center of the road, her dress billowing as if caught in an unseen wind. The headlights illuminated her fully now, and I could see her face, or rather the lack of it. Her features were smooth and blank, like a porcelain mask, and her head tilted unnaturally as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The singing started again, louder and more haunting than before. The figure stood unmoving, her faceless head tilted slightly as the haunting melody swelled, filling the RV like a physical presence. My chest tightened as I stared at her blank visage, the absence of features somehow more terrifying than if she'd been wearing a malicious grin. The headlights illuminated every torn thread of her dress, every unnatural angle of her body, and yet she didn't step forward. She didn't have to. The sound of her song was enough to paralyze us. "Ethan," I whispered, unable to tear my eyes away from her. "What do we do?" He didn't answer. His hands were gripping the wheel, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. For the first time since this nightmare started, Ethan looked utterly and completely terrified. The figure raised her hand. The motion was slow and deliberate, her arm extending toward us with an unnatural smoothness. My stomach lurched as she pointed directly at the RV, her head tilting farther to the side as the singing grew louder, more demanding. My hands instinctively covered my ears, but it didn't help. The song wasn't just a sound, it was inside my head, reverberating through my skull, filling every corner of my mind with its eerie, inescapable pull. "We have to move," I said, my voice trembling. "Ethan, we can't just sit here." "She's in the road," he snapped, his voice cracking. "If I hit her?" "She's not real," I shouted, my panic boiling over. "You saw her face! That thing isn't human." The figure took a single step forward. The RV shuddered as if it felt the impact of her footfall, the entire vehicle groaning under the weight of some unseen force. I gripped the edge of my seat, my body trembling as the song reached a crescendo. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt like I was drifting, floating toward her. Ethan slammed his fist against the dashboard, snapping me back to reality. "Hold on," he muttered, his voice low and resolute. Before I could ask what he meant, he hit the gas. The RV surged forward, the tires screeching against the damp pavement. I braced myself as we barreled toward the figure, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the song. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, her hands still raised, the empty space where her eyes should have been staring right through us. And then, just as we were about to hit her, she vanished. The RV skidded to a halt, the tires barely gripping the slick road. Ethan and I sat in stunned silence, the only sound our ragged breathing. I looked back through the rear window, half expecting to see her standing behind us, but there was nothing. Just fog. "Did we?" Ethan trailed off, his voice hollow. Did we hit her? No, I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. She disappeared. You saw it. Ethan exhaled shakily, leaning back against the seat. I don't understand this, he muttered. None of this makes any sense. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just happened, but there was no logic to it. The figure, the singing, the way the RV seemed to react to her presence, it was beyond anything I could explain. The singing started again. It was fainter now, coming from somewhere behind us, but it was unmistakable. I turned to look out the rear window again, and my blood ran cold. She was back. The figure stood in the middle of the road, farther away this time, but still visible through the fog. Her hand was lowered now, but her head was tilted at an even sharper angle, as if mocking us. She's behind us, I whispered. Ethan didn't look. He didn't need to. The look on his face told me he already knew. What do we do? I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan gripped the wheel, his jaw tight. We keep going. We don't stop until we're out of this fog. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed we could escape her. The RV moved forward again, slower this time, the engine rumbling as we navigated the winding road. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and every shadow felt like her figure, waiting to reappear. The singing followed us, never fading completely, always just at the edge of hearing. It was maddening, a constant reminder that we weren't alone. My hands gripped the armrests, my nails digging into the fabric as I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. Do you think she's following us? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Ethan didn't reply. His silence said enough. We rounded a sharp curve, and the RV's headlights caught something on the side of the road, a bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like strands of hair. I felt a chill run down my spine as we passed it, the bundle disappearing into the fog behind us. What was that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing, Ethan said quickly, his eyes fixed on the road. Just keep looking forward. But I couldn't. As the bundle disappeared into the mist, I thought I saw something else, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the headlights. It was tall and thin, its shape twisting unnaturally as it melted back into the fog. The singing grew louder. The singing seemed to surround us now, growing louder and more haunting with every turn of the road. The fog was alive, swirling and pressing against the RV like it wanted to devour us whole. Ethan's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his breath shallow and ragged as he navigated the narrow road. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the suffocating presence lingering just out of sight. She's not going to let us leave, I whispered, more to myself than to Ethan. Don't say that, he muttered, his voice strained. We're getting out of here. We have to. But even he didn't sound convinced. The headlights barely penetrated the fog, and every shadow felt like it was moving, creeping closer. My hands trembled as I gripped the armrest, my nails digging into the fabric. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, how she had appeared in the road, how her song had burrowed into my mind like a living thing. Did you see that bundle back there? I asked, breaking the silence. The one with the hair? Ethan's jaw tightened. I saw it. Don't think about it. Don't talk about. Why not? I demanded, my voice rising despite my fear. What if it's part of this? What if it's a warning? It doesn't matter, he snapped. We're not stopping to find out. Another turn in the road, another sharp bend cloaked in mist. The RV groaned as Ethan slowed, the tires slipping slightly on the damp pavement. I couldn't help but glance out the side window, my stomach knotting as I caught a glimpse of movement, something dark and indistinct, disappearing into the fog. "I saw her again," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ethan didn't respond, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He didn't want to acknowledge it. He didn't want to admit that no matter how far we drove, she was still with us. The RV jerked suddenly, throwing me against the seatbelt. Ethan cursed, slamming on the brakes as the vehicle came to a shuddering halt. My heart pounded as I looked at him, panic surging in my chest. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," he muttered, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. "Something's in the road." I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. There, lying across the pavement, was another bundle. This one was larger than the last, tied with the same strands of hair. It looked fresh, the sticks damp and glistening as though they had just been placed there. "Drive over it," I said, my voice urgent. "Don't stop." Ethan hesitated, his hands tightening on the wheel. "What if it's just go?" I shouted, cutting him off. "We can't stay here." He nodded, slamming his foot on the gas. The RV lurched forward, the tires crunching over the bundle with a sickening sound. I winced, my stomach twisting, but I forced myself to keep looking ahead. The singing stopped. The silence was immediate and overwhelming, pressing against my ears like cotton. It wasn't relief, it was wrong. The kind of silence that comes before something terrible. Ethan and I exchanged a glance, both of us holding our breath as we waited for the other shoe to drop. The fog shifted. It was subtle at first, the mist swirling in strange patterns, but then it thickened, darkened, until it was no longer just fog. Shadows moved within it, growing sharper, more defined. I could feel them watching us, their presence heavy and oppressive. "She's here," I whispered, my voice trembling. Ethan's hands trembled on the wheel. "Where?" "Everywhere," I said, my voice breaking. The shadows closed in, surrounding the RV, and then the first thud came. It hit the side of the vehicle hard enough to make it sway, followed by another and another. The sound of something, or someone, pounding against the metal. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the noise was relentless, reverberating through the RV like an echo chamber. "Go!" I shouted, my voice desperate. Ethan slammed the gas, the RV lurching forward, but the pounding didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was outside was trying to break in. The fog swirled faster, the shadows darting in and out of the light, and I could feel her. She wasn't just following us, she was inside the mist, her presence wrapping around the RV like a noose. Then, the windshield cracked. The sound was deafening, a sharp, splintering noise that made me scream. A jagged line spider-webbed across the glass, and for a moment, I thought it would shatter completely. Ethan cursed, his foot pressing harder on the gas, as the RV barreled down the road. The singing returned, was louder than ever, the melody twisting and distorting until it was almost a scream. My vision blurred, my head pounding as the sound filled every corner of my mind. I clutched my temples, trying to block it out, but it was no use. She was in my head now, and there was no escaping her. Ethan shouted something, but I couldn't hear him. The world was spinning, the RV shaking as if it were about to tear apart. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The fog lifted. The fog dissipated so quickly it was like someone had flipped a switch. One moment, we were surrounded by that oppressive gray void, the singing consuming every inch of space around us. The next, the road ahead was clear, bathed in the pale light of the moon. It should have been a relief, but the suddenness of it was unnerving. The RV's engine hummed steadily as Ethan and I sat in stunned silence, neither of us daring to speak. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the figure standing in the shadows, but there was nothing. The cliffside road stretched ahead, empty and quiet. Too quiet. Even the crash of the waves below seemed muted, as though the world was holding its breath. "Is it over?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer right away. His hands were still clenched around the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He nodded slightly, but his eyes darted to the rearview mirror, as if he couldn't quite believe we'd left her behind. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I'm not stopping to find out." He pressed the gas pedal a little harder, and the RV picked up speed. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Every shadow, every flicker of light on the road felt like her, like she was still there, waiting for the right moment to reappear. "I don't understand," I muttered mostly to myself. "What does she want? Why is she after us?" Ethan shook his head, his jaw tight. "I don't care what she wants. I just want to get the hell out of here." But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Whatever had happened back there, whatever she was, it wasn't something we could just leave behind. The thought of Maria twisted in my gut like a knife. I couldn't stop seeing her flashlight on the ground, the claw marks in the dirt, the way her voice had called out to us from the fog. "We should have gone back for her," I said quietly, my throat tight. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened even further. "And what? Ended up like her? You saw what happened? We couldn't save her." "You don't know that," I shot back, my voice rising. "We didn't even try." "She was already gone," Ethan shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space of the RV. He took a shaky breath, his eyes never leaving the road. "You heard her voice. That wasn't Maria anymore." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I couldn't. Whatever had been calling to us in the fog, it hadn't been Maria. Not really. The RV rounded a sharp curve, and I caught sight of something in the side mirror. My heart skipped a beat. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I swore I saw a shadow darting across the road behind us. "Ethan," I said, my voice trembling, "I think she's still following us." He didn't respond, but his foot pressed harder on the gas, the RV accelerating along the winding road. The engine groaned in protest, and I gripped the edge of my seat, my nails digging into the fabric. The silence was worse than the singing. It was oppressive, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced out the window again, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the cliffs and the ocean below, stretching endlessly into the night. Then, the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a brief dimming of the overhead bulbs, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. I looked at Ethan, panic rising in my chest. "What's happening?" "I don't know," he muttered, his voice tense. "Probably just the battery or something. We'll be fine." But we weren't fine. The lights flickered again, this time staying off for a full second before sputtering back to life. The dashboard lights dimmed, and the engine let out a low, rumbling groan. "She's not gone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's still here." Ethan didn't answer. He was focused on the road, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might crack a tooth. The RV felt heavier now, like it was dragging something behind it, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out, to run. But there was nowhere to go. The lights flickered a third time, plunging us into darkness. The RV's engine sputtered and died, the hum replaced by an eerie silence. The vehicle coasted to a stop, the tires crunching against gravel. My breath hitched as I realized we were stranded, alone on this desolate road with no way to escape. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan didn't respond. He was staring straight ahead, his hand still gripping the wheel. I followed his gaze, my stomach twisting into knots. She was there. The figure stood in the middle of the road, her dress billowing in an unseen wind. The headlights flickered weakly, casting her in an otherworldly glow. Her head tilted slowly to one side, the motion unnatural and deliberate. The song began again, soft and haunting, and I felt that same pull in my chest, the overwhelming urge to go to her. "We can't stay here," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "We have to move." "How?" I asked, panic rising. "The RV's dead." His eyes darted to the back of the vehicle. "We run." "We run?" I echoed, my voice trembling. "Are you insane? We don't even know where she is, or what she wants." Ethan's jaw tightened as he unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements stiff and deliberate. "We can't just sit here. If we stay, she's going to get in." I wanted to argue, to tell him there had to be another way, but the cracked windshield, the flickering lights, and the oppressive weight of the singing left me no room for rational thought. Every instinct screamed that staying in the RV wasn't safe anymore. Ethan grabbed the flashlight, which had been rattling uselessly on the dashboard, and shoved it into my hands. "Here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Stick close to me. Don't stop for anything." I nodded, gripping the flashlight like it was a lifeline. My palms were slick with sweat, and my legs felt like lead as I unbuckled my seatbelt and moved toward the door. Ethan's hand hovered over the handle for a moment, his breath shallow and ragged. "Ready?" he asked. No, I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. He yanked the door open, and the cold night air hit us like a slap. The fog was thinner now, but it clung to the road and the surrounding cliffs, shifting and swirling as if it were alive. The figure was still there, standing motionless in the middle of the road. Her head tilted unnaturally as the melody of her song twisted into a mournful wail. The sound vibrated through my chest, making it hard to breathe. Ethan climbed down first, and I followed, my boots crunching against the gravel. The RV loomed behind us, its lights flickering weakly as if it too were fighting to stay alive. Ethan grabbed my wrist, pulling me closer to him as he started walking briskly toward the edge of the road. "Stay close," he said, his voice tight. I didn't need to be told twice. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, and every step felt like wading through quicksand. The figure didn't move, but I could feel her watching us. Her song grew louder, wrapping itself around me like a snake, and for a moment, I thought my legs would give out. "Don't look at her," Ethan hissed, yanking my arm. "Just keep moving." I tore my gaze away from her and focused on the road ahead. It was narrow and uneven, the gravel slick beneath my feet. The cliffs on one side dropped into darkness, the faint roar of the waves below a constant reminder of how isolated we were. On the other side, the fog pressed against the hillside, shifting like a living thing. We moved as quickly as we could, but every few steps, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The figure remained in place, but the fog seemed to thicken around her, hiding her from view. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I knew she wasn't gone. She was just waiting. "What if she's following us?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of our footsteps. "She's not," Ethan said, though his voice wavered. "She's staying back." "How do you know?" I pressed. "I don't," he admitted. "But we can't stop to find out." We rounded a bend in the road, the RV disappearing from view behind us. The fog seemed thinner here, the moonlight cutting through just enough to illuminate the path ahead. For a brief moment, I let myself hope that we were getting closer to safety, that whatever had tethered her to us was starting to break. And then the singing stopped. I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. Ethan noticed immediately, his grip tightening on my wrist. "What is it?" he asked, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "She stopped," I said, my voice trembling. "The singing, it's gone." Ethan's face paled, but he didn't hesitate. "Keep moving. That's not a good thing." We pushed forward, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. Without the singing, every sound felt amplified. Our footsteps on the gravel, the rustling of the wind, the distant crash of the waves. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. And then, from somewhere behind us, came the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel with an unnerving rhythm. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned to look, and there she was. The figure had stepped out of the fog, her dress trailing behind her like smoke. She didn't move quickly, she didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to send a wave of terror coursing through me. "She's coming," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ethan didn't look back. "Run." He didn't wait for me to respond. He took off, pulling me with him, and I stumbled to keep up, the flashlight bobbing wildly in my hand. The road was uneven, the gravel shifting beneath my feet, but I didn't dare slow down. The footsteps behind us quickened, matching our pace, and the sound of her song returned, louder, more twisted, almost frantic. "Faster!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the fog. I tried. I pushed my legs harder, my lungs burning with every breath. But no matter how fast we ran, the footsteps stayed close, the song growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. It filled my head, my chest, my entire body, and I thought for sure I was going to collapse. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We stumbled to a halt, gasping for air, and turned back toward the road. The fog was thicker now, the path behind us completely obscured. The singing was gone, the footsteps silent. But we both knew she was still there, somewhere, waiting. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brought relief. It was heavy, oppressive, and filled with the knowledge that we were not alone. Ethan and I stood in the middle of the narrow road, gasping for air, the fog curling around us like tendrils of smoke. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely piercing the gloom. "Do you think she's gone?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan shook his head, his eyes darting nervously over his shoulder. "No," he said flatly. She's never gone. She's just waiting. Waiting. The words settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. My legs felt like jelly, and every breath I took felt like it might be my last. The path ahead seemed endless, the road stretching into the fog as if it were leading us nowhere. But there was no turning back now. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said, his voice firm despite the fear etched into his features. "If we stop, she'll catch up." I nodded, forcing my feet to move. Every step felt harder than the last, the weight of exhaustion and terror dragging me down. The song still echoed faintly in my head like the remnants of a nightmare that refused to fade. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who was she? Why was she after us? And most haunting of all, what had happened to Maria? The thought of her sent a fresh wave of guilt washing over me. I'd left her behind. I let my fear control me. And now, wherever she was alone. I swallowed hard, pushing the thought away. If I let it consume me, I'd never make it out of here alive. The fog began to thin slightly as we rounded another bend in the road. The moonlight broke through in pale, silvery beams, casting long shadows across the gravel. For the first time in what felt like hours, I could see more than a few feet in front of me. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The shadows seemed to move, twisting and shifting as if they were alive. "Do you see that?" I whispered, stopping in my tracks. Ethan turned to look, his jaw tightening. "See what?" "The shadows," I said, my voice barely audible. "They're moving." Ethan glanced around, his eyes narrowing. "It's the fog," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Keep going." I hesitated, my stomach churning, but I forced myself to follow him. The road was slick beneath my boots, and every crunch of gravel felt deafening in the stillness. My hands gripped the flashlight so tightly that my fingers ached, the small circle of light my only solace in the darkness. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. It came from somewhere to my left, just beyond the edge of the road. I stopped, my heart pounding as I strained to hear. The whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't just a sound, it was words. "Help me?" I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. "Maria?" I called out before I could stop myself. Ethan whipped around, his eyes. "Don't! Help me!" The voice came again, closer now, desperate and pleading. It sounded exactly like Maria. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the sound, my mind screaming at me to stop but my heart refusing to listen. "Lena, wait!" Ethan shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. "It's not her!" I turned to him, my eyes filling with tears. "What if it is?" I said, my voice breaking. "What if she's still alive? We can't just leave her." Ethan's grip tightened, his face pale and desperate. "It's not Maria," he said firmly. "You know it's not. Whatever's out there is trying to lure you in. Don't let it." The whisper came again, more insistent. "Please, help me." I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body trembling. Ethan was right. Deep down, I knew he was right. But hearing her voice, so real, so raw, was almost too much to bear. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to turn away from the sound. "Let's go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, releasing my arm. Stay close. No matter what you hear, don't stop. I nodded, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The road ahead seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, but I forced myself to keep moving. Whatever was behind us, whatever was waiting in the fog, I wasn't going to let it win. Not yet. Ethan and I moved quickly, though every step felt like wading through quicksand. The fog, though thinning, seemed to cling to us, wrapping around our legs and pulling at our minds. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to glance back, even though every nerve in my body screamed to check if she was still following us. The road felt endless. No matter how far we walked, the terrain never seemed to change. The gravel crunched beneath our boots, the only sound in the oppressive silence. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming and brightening sporadically. I shook it in frustration, my breath hitching when the light briefly went out altogether before sputtering back to life. Ethan broke the silence, his voice low and tense. "How much farther do you think it is?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "It feels like we've been walking forever." "Maybe we have," he muttered, his words barely audible. It wasn't just exhaustion I heard in his tone. It was defeat. And that scared me more than anything else. We pressed on, the silence broken only by the rhythmic sound of our footsteps. But then, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint change in the pressure around us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I knew she was close. The singing started again. It was softer this time, almost tender, like a lullaby meant to coax us into submission. My chest tightened as the melody seeped into my mind, weaving itself around my thoughts like a spider spinning a web. My feet faltered, the urge to stop overwhelming me. "Lena, keep going," Ethan said sharply, grabbing my arm and pulling me forward. His voice broke through the fog in my mind, snapping me out of the trance. I nodded, my legs trembling as I forced them to move. The singing grew louder, more insistent, as if she knew we were trying to resist her. The road ahead seemed to blur, the fog thickening once more, and I felt my grip on reality slipping. Shapes began to form in the mist, indistinct and shifting, their movements deliberate yet unnatural. Shadows danced along the edges of my vision, taunting me, daring me to look. "Don't stop," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear etched into his features. "Don't look at them. They're not real." I wanted to believe him, but the figures in the fog felt real, too real. They moved with purpose, their shapes contorting and twisting into forms I couldn't describe. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming until it finally went out completely. I stifled a cry, gripping Ethan's arm tightly. "She's playing with us," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," Ethan said, his jaw clenched. "But we're not giving her what she wants." "What does she want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Ethan didn't respond. His silence spoke volumes, and I realized he didn't know. Or worse, he did, and he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. The road began to slope upward, the incline slight but noticeable. My legs burned with every step, but I pushed through the pain, focusing on the ground in front of me. The fog thinned again, the shadows retreating, but the singing didn't stop. If anything, it became more desperate, more frantic, as if she knew we were slipping away. "Do you think we're getting close?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Maybe," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Just keep moving." we rounded another bend, and the road widened slightly, revealing an old wooden sign barely visible in the moonlight. The letters were faded and weathered, but I could just make out the words, Devil's Slide Trailhead. Relief flooded through me, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to hope. We're almost there, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Ethan nodded, his pace quickening. If we can make it to the main road, we'll be okay. But as we approached the sign, the air grew colder, and the fog thickened once more. The singing stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through my chest. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. We froze, our eyes darting around the fog, searching for the source of the sound. And then we saw her. She was standing just beyond the sign, her dress billowing in the windless air. Her head tilted slowly to one side, the motion deliberate and unnatural. The blank, faceless void where her features should have been stared at us, and though she didn't move, I could feel her pulling us toward her. Run, Ethan whispered. Ethan didn't wait for me to respond. The word run barely left his lips before he bolted, pulling me along with him. My legs felt like lead, but the primal instinct to survive overpowered everything else. The fog was thicker now, swirling around us like it had a mind of its own, and I could feel her presence closing in. The sound behind us wasn't footsteps anymore. It was something heavier, something unnatural, like the ground itself groaning under the weight of something massive. The deep, guttural sound echoed through the fog, vibrating in my chest and threatening to steal the air from my lungs. I didn't dare look back. "Keep going!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't stop!" I focused on his hand gripping mine, the only solid thing in a world that felt like it was unraveling. The trailhead was just ahead, the faded sign looming like a beacon in the mist. If we could make it past that point, maybe, just maybe, we'd be safe. But the closer we got, the louder the sound behind us grew. It wasn't just following us, it was chasing us. The fog twisted into shapes, shadows reaching out with clawed fingers. But I kept my eyes forward. I couldn't let them distract me. Not now. We reached the trailhead, and for a moment, I thought we'd made it. The fog thinned slightly, the shadows retreating, and the road ahead seemed clear. But then the singing started again. It was louder this time, more piercing, and it was coming from directly in front of us. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding as the figure emerged from the mist. She was standing in the middle of the road, her dress torn and dirty, her faceless head tilted in that same unnatural way. The song seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the air like a suffocating weight. Ethan pulled me to the side, dragging me off the road and into the trees. The branches scratched at my arms, and the ground beneath us was uneven, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from her. "Where are we going?" I gasped, my lungs burning. "Away from the road," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "She's blocking it. We'll circle back." The forest was dense, the trees packed so tightly together that the moonlight barely reached the ground. Fog wove between the trunks, clinging to us like it didn't want to let go. The singing followed us, growing softer and then louder again, like she was toying with us. Ethan stumbled, nearly falling, and I grabbed his arm to steady him. "You okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yeah," he panted. "Just keep going." We pushed deeper into the forest, the underbrush slowing us down with every step. My legs were shaking, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, but I refused to stop. The sound behind us had changed again, no longer a song, but something raw and guttural, like an animal growling deep in its throat. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. Ethan turned to look at me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Why did she stop?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "But I don't think that's a good thing." The silence pressed down on us, heavier than the fog. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, every breath loud and uneven. The air was so still it felt like the entire world holding its breath. Then, from somewhere in the distance, we heard it, a single, sharp crack. It echoed through the forest like a gunshot, and I flinched, grabbing Ethan's arm. The sound was followed by another, and another, closer and closer, until it was right behind us. Ethan turned to look, and his face went white. "Lena," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run." I didn't ask questions. I didn't look back. I just ran. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my legs screaming in protest. The growling was louder now, right on our heels, and I could feel the air shift as something massive moved through the trees. Branches snapped, the ground trembled, and my heart raced with the primal knowledge that I was running for my life. The trees began to thin, the edge of the forest coming into view. I could see the road ahead, the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the gravel. Ethan was just ahead of me, his silhouette barely visible through the mist. We burst out of the trees and onto the road, skidding to a halt. I turned to look back, expecting to see her, or whatever was chasing us. But there was nothing, just the fog, curling lazily at the edge of the forest, as if it were watching us. Ethan grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. "Don't stop," he said, his voice shaking. "We're not safe yet." I nodded, too exhausted to speak, and we started down the road again. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The fog might have stayed behind, but she hadn't. I could feel her, just out of sight, waiting for the next moment to strike. And I knew, deep down, that she always would be. We made it out of Devil's Slide that night, but I can't shake the feeling that we didn't truly escape her. I still hear the singing sometimes, soft, distant, but always there. And I can't help but wonder, what does she want? Why did she let us go, or did she? And most haunting of all, what really happened to Maria? What would you have done in our shoes? Would you have stayed in the RV or taken your chances running? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button to join us for more stories that will leave you questioning what's real. Don't forget to click the bell so you never miss an update, especially when the next horror story drops.